This Friday, according to the Hebrew calendar, will be the 50th day after Passover, known in Hebrew as Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. We know it in English as Pentecost, which comes from the Greek term for 50. However, due to differences between the Hebrew calendar and the Christian calendar, Pentecost this year will be celebrated 2 days later, on Sunday, for those who reside outside of Israel. Shavuot, or Pentecost, was one of the 3 yearly feasts that Israelites were required to celebrate at the temple in Jerusalem. And it was on that day that God handed down to Moses the 10 Commandments and the Torah from his holy mountain, Mount Sinai, as vividly described in Exodus 19. I encourage you to read this chapter in Exodus for yourselves and notice the similarities between that historic event, the founding of the nation of Israel via God's covenant teachings, and the one that we will focus on today, the founding of the church, through God's covenant seal of his Holy Spirit, as described in Ephesians 1:13 and 14. In this short lesson, we will spend most of our time close to Acts chapter 2 and the Temple Mount. According to Luke, Jesus had told the apostles to stay in Jerusalem until they were clothed in power from on high. He goes on to write that after Jesus ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives, the apostles returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God. So where did the birth of the church, which Jesus first made mention of at the gates of hell in Caesarea Philippi, which is just a few minutes' drive from our home on Mount Hermon, where did this event actually happen? Most people assume that the apostles, and those who were with them, about 120 people, were filled with the Holy Spirit in the upper room, which is referred to in Acts 1:13. However, this verse tells us only that this was where they returned after Jesus returned to heaven. As I mentioned before, all adult male Israelites were required to go up to Jerusalem each year to celebrate Pentecost. We find this requirement in Deuteronomy 16:16. Chapter 2 of Acts opens on the morning of Pentecost. Since all of the apostles and disciples of Jesus were observant Jews, they would have been in the Temple Mount for the morning sacrifice at sunrise. Being the actual day of Pentecost, it is unlikely that they would have left the temple area after the morning sacrifice. So where were they? Acts 2:1 tells us that on the day of Pentecost, the 12 apostles and the other 100 or so disciples were all together in one place. All of a sudden, a great sound like a mighty rushing wind filled the entire house where they were sitting. Because of the use of the word house, it is assumed that Luke is referring to the same location as the upper room mentioned in the previous chapter. But that cannot be correct, because as observant Israelites, they would have been in the temple complex for one of the 3 most important days of the year. We also know from Luke that the apostles and disciples were continually in the temple blessing God. This day would have been no different. In fact, because it is Pentecost, we are guaranteed that they were already in the temple from the break of day. So why did Luke use the word house to describe how the rushing wind filled it? It is because the temple was many times referred to as the house in both the Old Testament and New Testament. For instance, in Acts 7, Stephen, the first martyr, calls the temple a house which Solomon built. In 2 Samuel 7, God himself talks about the yet-to-be-built temple as a house. Even today, in modern Hebrew, the Temple Mount is called the mountain of the house. When the mighty rushing wind filled the entire house, Luke is talking about the Temple Mount. But where was the specific place where the apostles and disciples were gathered together? That place that Luke wrote about. Most likely, it was on one of the sections of Solomon's portico on the Temple Mount. Many rabbinic schools met there, and from numerous places in the Gospels we know that Jesus also taught many days in the temple complex. The apostles and disciples would have likely met in the same place that Jesus used to teach, just like how we like to sit in the same pew each Sunday. The Temple Mount is so large that it could hold over 200,000 people at one time. This helps explain why, After hearing the mighty rushing wind and seeing the tongues of fire resting on Jesus' apostles and disciples, so many Jews from around the known world could be together hearing their own languages being spoken by men from the Galilee. The commencement of the church was a very public event. Just as God wanted for the good news to go forth first from Jerusalem, so it would be the center of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, where the inauguration would take place. Ezekiel chapters 10 and 11 describe how the glory of the Lord left the temple, exited through the east gate, and stood on the Mount of Olives. Amazingly, here in Acts 2, we see a partial reversal of that process. Ezekiel 11 prophesies that God would gather the Israelites from the peoples and assemble them out of the countries where they had been scattered, and a new spirit I would put within them. In a partial fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy, God's Spirit returned to the Temple Mount that Pentecost day and filled his people. That's all for today of part 1. In the next vignette, we will continue Acts chapter 2 and discuss the geography of Peter's Pentecost sermon and where they would have been able to baptize a few thousand people in one day.